The courtroom fell silent the moment Rachel Baker stepped forward in a faded orange jail uniform, her wrists still marked by the handcuffs she had worn only minutes earlier. On the evidence table sat a single can of baby formula worth $47.89, the reason she had been arrested. As Judge Nathaniel Carter looked up to begin the hearing, his eyes locked onto the worn silver maple leaf necklace resting against Rachel's neck. The color drained from his face. Without a word, he rose from the bench and ordered the proceedings suspended. No one understood why one ordinary theft case had suddenly become impossible for the judge to hear. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If stories about kindness, justice, and second chances mean something to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. 5 days before anyone in Franklin County knew her name, Rachel Baker's alarm rang at exactly 5:15 every morning. She never needed a second alarm. The first soft chime was enough because mothers like Rachel rarely slept deeply. Even in silence, she listened for the smallest sound from the crib beside her bed. A tiny cough, a restless sigh, the familiar rustle of little Ethan turning beneath his dinosaur blanket. She opened her eyes before the alarm finished playing, reached toward the crib, and smiled when she found 2 sleepy brown eyes already staring back at her. "Good morning, sunshine," she whispered. Ethan answered with the wide grin that somehow survived every hardship surrounding them. Their apartment occupied the 3rd floor of an aging brick building on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. The hallway always smelled faintly of old paint and damp carpet. The heating system rattled every winter morning, and one kitchen window refused to close completely, no matter how much tape Rachel pressed around its frame. Still, she called it home. She believed children remembered love far longer than they remembered peeling wallpaper. Rachel lifted Ethan into her arms, kissed the top of his curly hair, and carried him toward the tiny kitchen. The coffee maker had stopped working months ago. Instead, she heated water in a dented kettle that had belonged to her mother. While it warmed, she carefully measured the last few scoops of Ethan's specialized baby formula into a sterilized bottle. She watched every grain fall. Nothing was wasted. Not one scoop, not one drop. The pediatrician had explained countless times that Ethan's severe milk protein allergy made ordinary infant formula dangerous. The specialized formula kept him healthy, but every can seemed more expensive than the one before. Rachel never complained in front of him. Babies deserved peaceful mornings. Adults could carry the worry. As Ethan drank happily from his bottle, Rachel opened the small blue notebook she kept beside the refrigerator. Every page contained neat handwriting: rent, electric bill, gas, bus pass, diapers, laundry, medicine, formula. She wrote every expense with the precision of someone trying to stretch time itself. At the bottom of the newest page, she stared at one number. Current checking account balance $118.64. She quietly circled it once before closing the notebook. Her mother's voice echoed somewhere deep inside her memory. "You don't count what you don't have, Rachel. You count what you can still do today." Rachel repeated those words almost every morning. They had become a prayer. She finished dressing Ethan in a clean blue romper that had once belonged to the son of a neighbor upstairs. Nearly everything Ethan owned had been passed from one family to another. Rachel never minded. Love didn't care whether clothes were new. Before getting ready for work, she stood before the narrow mirror hanging beside the apartment door. Her nursing home uniform was freshly washed, but beginning to fade around the sleeves. She tied her hair into a low bun. Then, almost without thinking, she touched the silver maple leaf pendant resting against her chest. The necklace was old. Its chain had been repaired twice. Tiny scratches covered the leaf. It had no diamonds, no real monetary value. But it was the only thing Rachel still owned that had belonged to her mother, Grace Baker. When Rachel was 12 years old, she had once asked why her mother treasured such an ordinary necklace. Grace had smiled without answering directly. "One day," she had said gently. placing the pendant around Rachel's neck. When life asks you to choose between becoming bitter or becoming kind, hold this. It will remind you who you are. Rachel hadn't understood then. Now she touched the pendant every day before walking out the door. Not because she believed it brought luck, because it reminded her she still carried part of her mother wherever she went. At 6:10 a.m., she bundled Ethan into his stroller and stepped into the chilly Ohio morning. Their first stop was Mrs. Denise Walker's apartment on the first floor. Mrs. Walker was 71 years old and watched Ethan while Rachel slept after working overnight shifts. The arrangement wasn't official childcare. Rachel couldn't afford that. Instead, Mrs. Walker accepted homemade soup, repaired groceries shelves, and occasional help carrying laundry in exchange for keeping Ethan safe. "You look tired again," Mrs. Walker said gently as Rachel handed Ethan over. "I'll survive." "You always say that." Rachel laughed softly. "Because it's still true." Mrs. Walker kissed Ethan's forehead. "Go earn your paycheck. I'll spoil this little man until you come back." Rachel thanked her and hurried toward the bus stop. The number 8 bus arrived at exactly 6:31. Most passengers ignored one another. Rachel liked it that way. She spent the 30-minute ride reviewing tomorrow's bills inside her head. When she arrived at Maple Grove Senior Care Center, the automatic doors slid open with their familiar mechanical sigh. The scent of disinfectant filled the lobby. Rachel had worked there for almost 4 years. Few residents knew her name. Many remembered her smile. She cleaned hallways before sunrise, polished handrails until they reflected light, emptied trash bins, disinfected wheelchairs, and quietly picked up family photographs that accidentally slipped from bedside tables. She believed no task was beneath her. Every room belonged to someone who deserved dignity. Around 8:40, she entered room 214. Mr. Leonard Hayes, an 86-year-old retired mail carrier, was already awake. "Morning, Miss Rachel," he said. "Morning, Mr. Hayes. You always whistle that same tune." Rachel hadn't noticed. "My mom used to hum it while cleaning." "Must have been a good woman." Rachel smiled. "The best." Mr. Hayes reached into his bedside drawer. "I saved something for you." He handed her a wrapped peppermint candy. Rachel hesitated. "I can't take your candy." "You always can." She accepted it with genuine gratitude. That tiny peppermint would stay in her pocket all day. Not because she planned to eat it. Because kindness deserved to be carried a little while before being used. As she continued mopping the hallway, Rachel watched families arriving to visit loved ones. Some carried flowers. Some brought balloons. Some never looked at the employees pushing cleaning carts quietly against the walls. She didn't resent them. Invisible work was still honest work. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't measured by who noticed you. It was measured by how faithfully you did what no one applauded. Just before the end of her shift, Rachel glanced at the calendar hanging near the staff break room. Payday was still 6 days away. Her stomach tightened. She mentally calculated how much formula remained at home. Not much, maybe enough for 4 days, if Ethan drank a little less. The thought immediately filled her with guilt. No child should ever have to drink less because money ran out. Rachel instinctively reached for the silver maple leaf necklace resting beneath her uniform collar. For a brief moment she closed her eyes. Then she straightened her shoulders, picked up her cleaning cart, and walked toward the next hallway. She had no idea that within a week, that small silver pendant would stop an entire courtroom. The first sign that Rachel's carefully balanced life was beginning to collapse came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had just finished wiping down the last hallway at Maple Grove Senior Care Center when her supervisor, Karen Mills, asked if she could stop by the office before leaving. Karen was not an unkind woman. She had managed the facility for nearly 15 years and hated conversations that involved budgets more than anyone knew. Rachel noticed the stack of printed schedules on Karen's desk before either of them spoke. "I wish I had better news," Karen said quietly. Rachel's stomach tightened. "The company is cutting operating costs again?" Rachel remained silent. "We're reducing housekeeping hours across every shift." She slid the new schedule across the desk. Rachel looked down. Instead of 5 overnight shifts each week, she had been assigned only 3. For several seconds, she simply stared at the paper. She didn't argue. She knew Karen hadn't made the decision. "How many hours am I losing?" Karen looked away. "About 16 each week." Rachel did the math automatically. Nearly 1/3 of her income. She nodded once. "When does it start?" "Tonight." Karen reached into a drawer and handed Rachel a list. "I wrote down 3 places that might be hiring cleaners." Rachel accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." "I really am sorry." Rachel forced a smile. "I know." She walked out carrying the folded schedule inside her bag, but it felt much heavier than paper. Outside rain soaked the parking lot. She stood beneath the small entrance canopy for nearly a minute before walking toward the bus stop. On the ride home, she opened the blue notebook again. She crossed out next week's expected income. Then she carefully wrote the new amount underneath. The difference looked small on paper. In real life, it meant groceries. It meant diapers. It meant bus fare. It meant baby formula. That evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Rachel spread every bill across the kitchen table. Rent, electricity, gas, internet, the pediatric clinic. She rearranged them over and over as though changing their order might somehow change the numbers. It didn't. She picked up a pencil and began making impossible decisions. Delay the electric bill. Skip replacing her worn work shoes. Cancel the inexpensive phone insurance. No coffee, no takeout, no laundry service. She already lived without luxuries. Now she was beginning to eliminate necessities. The next morning, she visited the county assistant's office before heading to work. The waiting room was already crowded. Young mothers bounced restless toddlers on their knees. An elderly veteran stared silently at the floor. A man in construction boots filled out paperwork with cracked hands. Everyone there had a different story. Everyone was hoping someone behind a desk might make life a little less impossible. After nearly 2 hours, Rachel finally sat across from a caseworker named Melissa. Melissa reviewed Rachel's documents carefully. Income statements, lease agreement, medical paperwork, Ethan's diagnosis. She typed for several minutes before sighing softly. "I'm sorry." Rachel leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "You don't qualify." Rachel blinked. "There has to be a mistake." Melissa turned the computer monitor slightly. "Your monthly income exceeds the eligibility limit." "By how much?" Melissa hesitated. Rachel watched her eyes. $11.42. Rachel thought she had misheard. $11? Melissa nodded apologetically. "I know it doesn't seem fair." Rachel let out a quiet laugh that sounded more exhausted than amused. "If I'd earned $12 less, you would qualify?" Rachel looked down at her hands. The room suddenly felt smaller. "I clean nursing home floors." "I understand." "I work nights." Melissa nodded again. "I know." "My son has a medical prescription for his formula." "I've read the doctor's report." Rachel swallowed hard. "So, because I earned $11 too much, the system won't allow me to approve it." Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Finally, Melissa reached into a drawer. "This isn't official assistance." She handed Rachel a printed sheet. "It's a list of churches and community food pantries." Rachel accepted it. "Thank you." She stood. Before leaving, Melissa quietly added, "Please don't wait until things become an emergency." Rachel smiled politely. They already have. Outside, the afternoon sun had replaced the morning rain. People hurried along the sidewalks carrying shopping bags and iced coffees. Life continued as though nothing had happened. Rachel walked 3 blocks before sitting on a bus bench. She opened the blue notebook again. Below her newest calculations, she wrote one sentence: find another job. Over the next 2 weeks, she applied everywhere she could: a grocery store, a motel, a laundromat, an office building, a warehouse. Some never called back. Others wanted experience she didn't have. One manager smiled sympathetically before saying they had already filled the position that morning. Every rejection sounded polite. Every rejection carried the same meaning. Not you. Meanwhile, Ethan continued growing. His appetite increased exactly as babies were supposed to. Rachel celebrated every healthy bottle he finished, then worried about how many remained. One evening, she counted the unopened containers inside the kitchen cabinet. 2. The first would probably last until Sunday. The second until Wednesday. After that, she closed the cabinet before finishing the thought. The following Saturday, she walked to a neighborhood pawn shop carrying the only appliance she still owned that had any value: an old microwave. The owner examined it briefly. I can give you $25. Rachel had paid nearly $100 for it years earlier. I understand. She accepted the cash without negotiating. On the way home, she stopped outside a small bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the open door. She looked at the menu. A soup and sandwich special cost $9.50. She checked her wallet. Then she kept walking. That night, she boiled plain rice. She mashed a banana into Ethan's dinner. For herself, she poured a glass of water and told her stomach she wasn't hungry. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. As Ethan finished eating, he reached toward her with both tiny hands. Rachel lifted him into her lap. He laughed and touched the silver maple leaf necklace resting against her chest. His little fingers wrapped around it with surprising gentleness. Rachel smiled through tired eyes. My grandma gave this to Mommy. Ethan babbled happily. I hope one day, she whispered, kissing his forehead, you never have to understand why some mothers skip dinner. She held him until he fell asleep against her shoulder. After laying him in his crib, Rachel returned to the kitchen. She opened the cabinet one more time. Only one full can of specialized baby formula remained. She checked the calendar. Payday was still 6 long days away. For the first time in years, Rachel admitted a terrifying truth to herself. She was running out of choices. Wednesday arrived colder than usual. Rachel woke before dawn to the sound she had begun to fear more than any alarm. Ethan was crying. Not the sleepy cry that faded with a bottle or a cuddle. This one was sharp, restless, and desperate. She hurried to his crib, lifted him into her arms, and gently pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. Warm. Too warm. She found the digital thermometer in the bathroom cabinet, 100.8 degrees. It's okay, she whispered, rocking him gently. Mommy's here. She prepared the last bottle of specialized formula, shaking it carefully to make sure not a single scoop remained clumped inside. Ethan drank eagerly, but Rachel noticed something that tightened her chest. The can was empty. She turned it upside down over the sink. Only a thin dusting of powder fell onto the counter. Nothing more. Rachel stood motionless for several seconds. She looked at the empty can, then at Ethan, then back at the empty can. There was no formula left in the apartment. She opened the blue notebook once again. Checking account balance, $58.17. Inside her wallet, she found one $20 bill, a 10 2/5s, 3 1s, and 17 cents in loose change. She already knew the price of Ethan's prescription formula, $47.89. She also knew the pediatrician had instructed her to keep infant acetaminophen at home, because fevers could become dangerous if his allergy triggered dehydration. She searched the medicine cabinet. The bottle was nearly empty. Enough for one more dose. Rachel called the pediatric clinic before leaving the apartment. After waiting on hold for nearly 20 minutes, a nurse answered. The fever isn't dangerously high yet, the nurse explained. Keep him hydrated, monitor him closely, and continue using the specialized formula. Don't switch brands. His allergy history is too severe. Rachel thanked her quietly. She didn't mention she had no formula left. She couldn't bring herself to say the words aloud. Mrs. Denise Walker agreed to watch Ethan for a few hours. If you need anything, call me, the elderly woman said. I won't be long. Rachel smiled, though neither of them believed it. She boarded the number 8 bus toward the Value Mart supermarket across town. The ride seemed longer than usual. Every stoplight felt personal. Every delay stole another minute from Ethan. When she entered the brightly lit store, cheerful music floated through the speakers. Children laughed near the bakery. A young couple debated which breakfast cereal to buy. An employee stacked colorful displays of summer drinks near the entrance. Life looked comfortable for everyone else. Rachel pushed a shopping basket slowly toward the pharmacy aisle. She picked up a bottle of infant fever reducer. Price $12.64. Then she walked to the baby section. There it was. The familiar silver and blue can. Hypoallergenic infant formula, $47.89. She stared at the price tag until the numbers blurred. $58.17. She took out her phone and opened the calculator. Formula, medicine, tax. The total climbed past what she had. She calculated again. Maybe she had entered something incorrectly. She hadn't. Rachel leaned against the shopping cart. Her breathing became shallow. She looked around the aisle. A father casually placed 3 cans into his cart without checking the price. Another mother compared different brands while talking on the phone. Rachel wasn't jealous. She simply wished choosing between medicine and food wasn't something any parent had to do. She placed both items into her basket, then walked away. Halfway to the registers, she stopped. No. She returned the formula to the shelf. She held only the medicine now. Ethan needed to bring the fever down first. She took 5 more steps, then stopped again. What good was medicine if tomorrow he had nothing to eat? She turned around, picked up the formula once more, back to the calculator. Again, again, again. The numbers refused to change. Finally, Rachel sat on a bench near the baby aisle. She lowered her face into her hands. No tears came. She felt too exhausted to cry. Instead, she remembered her mother's voice. When life asks you to choose between becoming bitter or becoming kind, Rachel instinctively touched the silver maple leaf necklace. I'm trying, Mom, she whispered. I really am. An elderly employee stocking diapers noticed her. You doing okay, honey? Rachel forced a smile. Just tired. The woman nodded kindly and continued working. Rachel wished she had asked for help. Instead, pride kept her silent. She had already borrowed enough from neighbors, already accepted enough kindness, already felt like she was failing. She stood, walked back toward the checkout lanes. She placed the medicine on the conveyor belt. Then, at the last second, she quietly removed it. She stood perfectly still. One hand rested on the shopping cart. The other gripped the can of formula. If I buy the medicine, she whispered to herself, he'll have nothing to drink tomorrow. If I buy the formula... She couldn't finish the sentence. Her hands trembled. Slowly, almost mechanically, she slipped the can beneath Ethan's folded blanket inside the stroller. Her breathing became louder. She hated herself the instant she did it. She paid for a loaf of discounted bread, a package of bananas, and a small pack of diapers. The cashier smiled politely. Have a nice day. Rachel nodded without meeting her eyes. Each step toward the automatic exit doors felt impossibly heavy. She could still turn around. She could return the formula. She could... The doors slid open. A cool breeze hit her face. Then came the sound. A sharp electronic alarm echoed through the entrance. Everyone stopped. 2 security employees looked toward her. Rachel froze. One guard approached carefully. Ma'am, Rachel closed her eyes. For one brief second, she considered running. Instead, she reached into the stroller herself. With shaking hands, she lifted out the hidden can of baby formula. "I know," she said softly, before anyone accused her. "I know." The entire entrance fell silent. "I wasn't stealing for myself." Her voice cracked for the first time all day. "My son can't drink regular formula." The security guard remained professional. "I'm going to need you to come with us." Rachel nodded immediately. She didn't argue. She didn't resist. She didn't beg. She simply held the can against her chest one last time before gently placing it on the counter beside the customer service desk. As another employee called the police, Rachel looked through the front windows toward the cloudy Ohio sky. All she could think was one heartbreaking question. Who was feeding Ethan now? The police cruiser arrived 12 minutes later. To Rachel, it felt like 12 hours. She remained seated in the small security office behind the customer service desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The unopened can of infant formula rested on the table between her and the loss prevention manager, like an exhibit in a museum, a silent reminder of the choice she wished she had never made. No one yelled at her. No one insulted her. In some ways, that made everything hurt even more. The room was painfully ordinary. A humming fluorescent light, a wall clock ticking louder than it should, a coffee mug with a chipped handle. The everyday setting made the moment feel real in a way she still struggled to accept. When Officer Marcus Reed entered, he removed his rain-speckled cap and greeted everyone with a calm nod. "Afternoon." The loss prevention manager handed him the report. "Female suspect. Shoplifting. 1 can of specialty infant formula. Total value $47.89. Marcus glanced toward Rachel. She looked nothing like the people he usually arrested for organized retail theft. Her faded work shoes were still damp from the rain. There was bleach on one sleeve of her housekeeping uniform. Dark circles rested beneath exhausted eyes. She looked more tired than dangerous. Marcus sat across from her. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Marcus Reed." Rachel nodded. "I'll need to ask you a few questions." "I understand." "Did you intentionally leave the store without paying for the formula?" Rachel lowered her eyes. "Yes." There was no hesitation. No attempt to invent a story. Marcus noticed. "Is there anything you'd like to add?" Rachel inhaled slowly. "My son needs that formula." Marcus waited. She continued quietly. "He has a severe allergy." Another pause. "I know that's not an excuse." Marcus looked at the report again. "No previous arrests?" "No." "No warrants?" "No." He studied her face for a moment. "You understand that I still have to follow procedure?" "I know." There was no anger in her voice, only resignation. Marcus had worn a badge for nearly 17 years. He had learned that guilt often shouted, desperation usually whispered. Rachel whispered. As he filled out the paperwork, his phone vibrated. Dispatch. He answered briefly before hanging up. Then he looked back at Rachel. "Do you have someone who can care for your child?" At that question, something inside Rachel finally cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for tears to gather. "My neighbor is watching him." She swallowed hard. "Please," Marcus looked up. "Please make sure he's been fed." It wasn't a request for freedom. It wasn't a plea to avoid charges. It wasn't even about herself. "My son," she whispered. "Has my son eaten yet?" Marcus hesitated. "I don't know." Rachel closed her eyes. "He needs to eat every few hours." Her voice trembled. "The formula." She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus quietly took out his notebook. "What's your neighbor's name?" "Denise Walker." "Address," Rachel gave it. Marcus stepped into the hallway and made 2 phone calls. The first was to dispatch. The second was to Franklin County Family Services. 20 minutes later, social worker Linda Collins arrived. She was in her early 50s. with silver strands beginning to appear through dark hair tied into a practical ponytail. She entered carrying a leather folder instead of judgment. "Rachel Baker." Rachel stood immediately. "Yes." "I'm Linda Collins." Rachel's first words surprised everyone in the room. "Has my son eaten?" Linda blinked. "You haven't asked what's happening to you?" Rachel shook her head. "Please." Linda offered a gentle smile. "I spoke with Mrs. Walker." Rachel held her breath. "Your little boy is safe." Rachel's shoulders dropped. "Mrs. Walker borrowed a can of specialty formula from another mother in the building." Rachel covered her mouth. "He already had his bottle?" For the first time since the alarm had sounded in the supermarket, Rachel cried. Not loudly, not uncontrollably, just quiet tears of relief. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over. "I'm so sorry." Linda handed her a tissue. "You don't need to apologize for loving your child." Rachel looked down. "I broke the law." Linda answered carefully. "Yes." Another silence. "But that's not the whole story." Marcus heard those words. He didn't respond. He simply continued typing. Procedure was procedure. Still, the sentence stayed with him. An hour later, Rachel was fingerprinted. The camera flash illuminated her tired face as the booking photograph was taken. She had seen mugshots on television before. She never imagined becoming one. A detention officer removed her necklace briefly during processing. Rachel reached toward it instinctively. "Please!" The officer looked puzzled. "It was my mother's." After confirming it had no safety concerns, the officer returned it. Rachel immediately fastened it around her neck again. Her fingers lingered on the silver maple leaf, almost as though touching it reminded her she was still herself. Even here. Meanwhile, outside the station, the incident had already begun spreading online. Someone in the supermarket had secretly recorded the arrest. The short video showed only the final moments. A woman in a housekeeping uniform, a police officer, handcuffs, a can of baby formula, no explanation. Within hours, local social media pages filled with comments. "If you steal, you pay." "Being a mother isn't an excuse." "Everyone has problems." Others reacted differently. "Look at her face. She doesn't look dangerous." "Something must have happened." "I wish people would ask why before judging." The debate grew quickly, but the truth remained invisible. No video showed Rachel calculating prices in the baby aisle. No one recorded her putting the formula back on the shelf 3 separate times. No camera captured her whispering to herself, or praying, or choosing between medicine and food. People judged 10 seconds. They never saw the weeks leading to those 10 seconds. Late that evening, Marcus finished the final report. He walked past the holding area before ending his shift. Rachel sat alone on the metal bench, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't crying anymore. She was quietly humming. Marcus listened for a moment. It was a simple melody, gentle, almost like a lullaby. He remembered hearing his own grandmother hum something similar decades earlier. Without thinking, he asked, "What's that song?" Rachel looked up. "My mother used to sing it whenever life became difficult." Marcus nodded once. "It sounds comforting." Rachel gave a faint smile. "It reminds me that tomorrow still comes." Marcus didn't know how to answer. He simply walked away. But long after leaving the station, driving through the rain toward home, he found himself thinking less about the crime report on the passenger seat, and more about a mother who had spent an entire afternoon asking only one question. "Has my son eaten yet?" Judge Nathaniel Carter had built a reputation over 3 decades by refusing to let emotion outrun the law. Attorneys respected him. Some feared him. New prosecutors were often warned before appearing in his courtroom. "Come prepared. Judge Carter has read every page before you walk in." He believed that justice began with discipline, He arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse every weekday at exactly 7:10 a.m., parked in the same corner space, carried the same black leather briefcase, and greeted the same security officers by name. Routine had become the quiet architecture of his life. After his wife Margaret passed away from pancreatic cancer 9 years earlier, routines had filled the silence that grief left behind. His house, a modest brick home on the north side of Columbus, reflected the same careful order. Every book stood upright. Every picture frame remained perfectly straight. Every evening he washed one coffee mug, one dinner plate, and one wine glass, though he no longer drank wine. Margaret's glass remained in the cabinet, untouched. Not because he expected her to return, because removing it felt too much like saying goodbye a second time. At 6:00 every morning, Nathaniel ground fresh coffee beans by hand. Margaret had once teased him for refusing to buy an electric grinder. "You know machines exist for this." "They're too loud," he had answered. "You just like making life harder." He had smiled. Maybe. Now, years later, he still turned the small wooden handle every morning. The soft, grinding sound reminded him that some rituals deserved to survive loss. That Wednesday morning, after pouring coffee into his favorite navy blue mug, Nathaniel unfolded the local newspaper. One article caught his attention, not because of its headline, because it reflected a problem he had watched growing for years. Food insecurity among working families had reached another record high. He quietly folded the paper. Statistics had become strangely numb to him. Every number represented someone: a child, a parent, a veteran, a widow. Yet courtrooms rarely dealt with statistics. They dealt with people after something had already gone wrong. At 7:45, his longtime judicial assistant, Claire Morrison, knocked gently on his office door. "Good morning, Judge." "Morning, Claire." She placed several case folders onto his desk. "Busy docket today." Nathaniel adjusted his reading glasses. "Anything unusual?" Claire checked her notes. "A custody hearing." He nodded. "A probation review." Another nod. "And a misdemeanor theft scheduled for Monday." He barely looked up. "Retail theft." "Yes." "Any prior convictions?" Claire flipped through the paperwork. "None." Nathaniel reached for the folder. The cover read, "State of Ohio, v. Rachel Baker. Charge petty theft. Property value $47.89. He opened the file. Police report, store surveillance summary, evidence inventory, booking information. Everything appeared straightforward. A woman had concealed 1 can of specialized infant formula before attempting to leave a Value Mart supermarket without paying, apprehended peacefully, cooperative, no resistance, no criminal history. Nathaniel had seen hundreds of similar cases. He continued reading. Employment housekeeping, Maple Grove Senior Care Center, single parent, dependent child. He paused briefly. Not because any of that affected guilt. It didn't. Facts established actions. Circumstances explained them. The law required him to consider both, but only in their proper place. He turned another page. Officer Marcus Reed's report stood out for its unusually careful language. Nathaniel noticed one sentence under the section labeled Defendant Statements. "My son needs that formula." Another. "Please make sure he's been fed." Nathaniel stopped reading. He leaned back in his chair. In decades on the bench, he had learned something most law books never taught. The first words people spoke after being arrested often revealed who they truly were. Some asked about lawyers. Some demanded phone calls. Some cursed. Some blamed everyone else. According to the report, Rachel Baker had asked only whether her baby had eaten. He quietly removed his glasses. For reasons he couldn't explain, that detail lingered. Claire returned, carrying another folder. "Judge?" "Yes." "Everything all right?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Just thinking." Claire glanced towards the paperwork. "I remember that case." "You do?" "It happened to be on the news." Nathaniel looked at her. The internet has already decided she's guilty. Claire hesitated before speaking. The comments were harsh. Nathaniel closed the folder. Public opinion isn't evidence. No, sir. But it has a way of trying to become evidence. Claire understood exactly what he meant. After she left, Nathaniel stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Columbus. Traffic flowed steadily below. People hurried to work carrying briefcases, backpacks, and coffee cups. From this height, every person looked equally small. The law often tried to treat everyone equally. Life rarely did. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. His calendar reminded him of something else. The anniversary of his law school graduation was only a week away. 30 years. He smiled to himself. Time moved strangely after 60. Some memories faded. Others remained untouched. Almost without thinking, Nathaniel crossed the room to an old oak cabinet standing beside the bookshelf. He opened the lower drawer. Inside sat a small wooden box no larger than a dictionary. Its edges were worn smooth with age. A brass latch kept it closed. Nathaniel rested his fingertips on the lid. For a long moment he didn't move. He hadn't opened the box in years, maybe longer. Margaret used to ask about it occasionally. What's inside? Old reminders. You never look at them. I know. Then why keep them? Nathaniel had never answered, because he wasn't sure himself. The box held pieces of a chapter he had never completely understood. Names, letters, receipts, a faded photograph, fragments of gratitude that had never found their destination. He almost opened it. Instead, he withdrew his hand. Not today. He returned to his desk and placed Rachel Baker's case file neatly on top of Monday's docket. Just another hearing. Just another defendant. Just another decision that would need to follow the law. Or so he believed. Across town, Rachel sat alone in a county holding room, unaware that the man who would soon preside over her case had already read every page describing the worst day of her life. Neither of them could have imagined that a single, worn, silver maple leaf necklace quietly resting against Rachel's heart was about to unlock a memory buried for 30 years. By Friday morning, Rachel Baker had stopped trying to guess what people thought of her. The first 24 hours had been the hardest. Every time a detention officer walked past her holding cell, she imagined another stranger who had already watched the supermarket video online. The headlines had been painfully simple. Mother arrested for stealing baby formula. No headline mentioned Ethan's allergy. None mentioned the empty kitchen cabinet. None mentioned that Rachel had walked back and forth through the baby aisle for nearly 20 minutes before making the worst decision of her life. To the public, she had become one more face attached to one more crime. Inside the Franklin County Public Defender's Office, Attorney Emily Foster scanned the thin case file while sipping lukewarm coffee. 38 years old, Emily had spent over a decade representing people most of society had already judged before they entered a courtroom. She had defended veterans suffering from PTSD, teenagers who made one terrible mistake, single fathers unable to pay impossible fines, women escaping abusive homes. Every file contained more than criminal charges. Every file contained a human life. Rachel's folder looked surprisingly light. No criminal history, stable employment, consistent tax records, positive employer evaluations. Emily frowned. People with records like this rarely appeared in court for theft. She picked up her legal pad and headed toward the county detention center. Rachel looked exhausted when she entered the interview room. Dark circles framed her eyes. Her housekeeping uniform had been replaced with standard detention clothing, but the silver maple leaf necklace still rested gently against her collarbone. Emily introduced herself. I'm Emily Foster. I'll be representing you. Rachel nodded politely. Thank you for coming. Emily sat down. I've reviewed the police report. Rachel stared quietly at the table. I need you to tell me everything. Rachel inhaled slowly. I stole the formula. I know. I don't want you wasting your time trying to prove I didn't. Emily leaned forward. My job isn't to invent facts. Rachel finally looked up. It's to understand them. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Then Rachel began. She talked about Ethan's diagnosis, about the overnight cleaning job, about losing 16 hours every week, about being denied assistance because she earned $11.42 too much. She described every attempt she had made before entering Value Mart, the extra job applications, selling the microwave, skipping meals, borrowing diapers from neighbors. Emily interrupted only to clarify dates or names. When Rachel finished, the room remained silent. Emily slowly closed her notebook. You left something out. Rachel looked confused. I did. You said you had $58. Yes? You could have bought the formula. Rachel shook her head. No. Emily waited. Rachel answered softly. Then I couldn't have bought Ethan's fever medicine. The words settled heavily between them. Emily had represented hundreds of clients. Very few had explained desperation so simply. Rachel wasn't asking anyone to excuse her choice. She was explaining the impossible choice itself. Emily changed direction. Tell me about Ethan's father. Rachel gave a tired smile. He left when Ethan was 2 months old. Any child support? He disappears whenever the paperwork catches up to him. Emily made another note. Family. My mother passed away 6 years ago. Father. I never knew him. Siblings. Rachel shook her head. No. Emily noticed Rachel unconsciously touching the necklace. You've reached for that 3 times. Rachel looked down at the silver maple leaf. I didn't realize. It must mean something. A gentle smile crossed Rachel's face for the first time. It belonged to my mom. Emily studied the worn pendant. It's beautiful. It isn't expensive. That's usually not what makes something valuable. Rachel nodded. My mother wore it every day. What did she do? She cleaned buildings. Emily smiled. So did you. Rachel laughed quietly. I guess I learned from the best. She paused before continuing. She used to tell me something whenever life became difficult. What was it? Rachel's voice softened. People may remember the worst day of your life. God remembers every good day you lived before it. Emily wrote the sentence in the margin of her notebook. It didn't belong in any legal argument, but somehow it felt important. They spent another hour reviewing every detail surrounding the arrest. When they finished, Emily asked one final question. If the judge offered to dismiss everything today on one condition that you never spoke about this again, would you accept? Rachel hesitated. I don't know. Emily waited. Rachel looked out the small, reinforced window. I'd be grateful. Another pause. But there are other mothers making the same choices I almost made. Emily slowly nodded. So this isn't only about you anymore. Rachel shook her head. It stopped being only about me the moment Ethan was born. Emily left the detention center carrying far more questions than when she had entered. Instead of driving directly back to her office, she made an unexpected stop at Maple Grove Senior Care Center. Karen Mills welcomed her into the administrative office. I was wondering if someone would come. Emily introduced herself. I'm representing Rachel Baker. Karen's expression immediately softened. How is she? Scared. Karen looked down. So are we. Emily requested Rachel's employment records. Karen didn't simply hand over the file. She opened it. 4 years. Perfect attendance except when Ethan was hospitalized, no disciplinary actions, consistently excellent evaluations. Karen pulled another sheet from the folder. Actually, she hesitated. You should probably have this. It was a handwritten letter. Mr. Leonard Hayes, one of the elderly residents, had dictated it after hearing about Rachel's arrest. Karen read part of it aloud. Miss Rachel never walked past my room without asking if I needed anything. Last Christmas, she spent her own lunch break fixing the photograph of my late wife, because the frame had broken. If that young woman is a criminal, then I've misunderstood goodness my entire life. Emily carefully accepted the letter. May I include this? Please. Before leaving, Emily spoke with several employees. Every story sounded remarkably similar. Rachel often stayed after her shift ended to help residents who had no visitors. She bought birthday cards with her own money. She learned everyone's favorite music. She never complained. Driving back downtown, Emily realized something unusual. The prosecution possessed one undeniable fact. Rachel had stolen. But the defense possessed something equally undeniable. Rachel Baker had spent years quietly serving people no one else noticed. That evening, Emily spread every document across her office conference table. Employment records, medical reports, financial statements, character references. She reached for the photograph taken during Rachel's booking. For the first time, she noticed the silver maple leaf necklace resting against Rachel's neck. Something about it seemed strangely familiar. She couldn't explain why. She simply stared at it for a long moment before setting the picture aside. In 3 days, Rachel Baker would stand before Judge Nathaniel Carter. Neither woman knew that the small silver pendant would become the one piece of evidence no attorney had prepared to explain. Monday morning arrived beneath a gray Ohio sky. By 8:15 a.m., the hallways of the Franklin County Courthouse had already filled with attorneys carrying legal pads, deputies escorting defendants, anxious families whispering in waiting areas, and reporters hoping for something unusual to happen on an otherwise routine docket. Rachel Baker stood quietly outside Courtroom 4B. She wore a simple navy blouse that Emily Foster had borrowed from the public defender's emergency clothing closet. The sleeves were slightly too long, and the shoes were half a size too big, but they were clean. Rachel was grateful for that. She had spent nearly an hour that morning trying to smooth the wrinkles from the blouse, with nothing more than warm water and her hands. Emily approached carrying 2 folders. "How are you feeling?" Rachel gave an honest answer. "Terrified." "That's understandable. I've never even had a speeding ticket." Emily offered a reassuring smile. "Today, just tell the truth. Leave everything else to me." Rachel nodded. "How's Ethan?" Linda Collins had texted Emily less than 20 minutes earlier. "Mrs. Walker says he smiled after breakfast." Rachel finally exhaled. Good. Nothing else mattered more. A bailiff stepped into the hallway. State of Ohio versus Rachel Baker. Emily placed one hand gently on Rachel's shoulder. "Ready." Rachel wasn't, but she walked forward anyway. The courtroom looked larger than she had imagined. Dark wooden benches stretched across the room. An American flag stood beside the judge's bench. The county seal hung high on the wall, reminding everyone that justice belonged to the law, not to emotion. Rachel had seen courtrooms on television. None of them had felt this quiet. She sat beside Emily at the defense table. Across the aisle, Assistant Prosecutor Daniel Whitaker organized several files without looking up. Everything appeared routine. Another misdemeanor case, another busy Monday. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the courtroom deputy announced, "All rise." Everyone stood. Judge Nathaniel Carter entered wearing his black judicial robe, his expression calm and unreadable. He thanked the courtroom and took his seat. One by one, the morning cases proceeded. Traffic violations, probation matters, a licensing dispute. Nathaniel handled each with the same measured professionalism that had defined his career. Rachel listened without hearing much. She folded and unfolded her hands beneath the table. Every few minutes, she touched the silver maple leaf necklace resting against her chest. It was an unconscious habit, something her mother had done whenever she became nervous. At 10:42 a.m., the courtroom deputy called the next case. State of Ohio versus Rachel Baker. Rachel stood. Emily rose beside her. Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the file in front of him. Case number, charge, appearances. Everything matched what he had reviewed 3 days earlier. He spoke without looking up. "Good morning." Emily introduced herself. The prosecutor followed. Nathaniel nodded. Then, as he routinely did before every hearing, he raised his eyes toward the defendant. Time stopped. His gaze settled first on Rachel's face. Tired eyes, quiet posture, a woman clearly carrying more weight than the courtroom could see. Then, his eyes dropped slightly. To the necklace, the silver maple leaf, the tiny scratch across the center vein, the repaired clasp, every detail. Exactly. His heartbeat stumbled. No, it couldn't be. He leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Rachel, believing the judge had asked a question she hadn't heard, lifted her chin. The pendant shifted gently in the courtroom light. Nathaniel felt the blood drain from his face. 30 years disappeared in an instant. He wasn't seeing a defendant anymore. He was seeing another woman, another hallway, another building, another winter. A woman pushing an old custodial cart through the law school after midnight. A silver maple leaf catching the fluorescent lights as she smiled. "Study while it's quiet," she had once told him. "I'll finish mopping around you." The memory struck with such force that he forgot where he was. "Your Honor," the prosecutor's voice pulled faintly at the edge of his thoughts. Nathaniel blinked once, then again. He looked back at Rachel. She noticed something changing in his expression. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. Emily noticed it too. She leaned slightly toward Rachel. "Don't say anything." Rachel whispered, "I wasn't going to." The courtroom remained silent. Nathaniel slowly removed his reading glasses. His hands were steady, his breathing wasn't. He looked once more at the necklace. There was no mistake. He knew that pendant. He knew it as surely as he knew his own signature. The courtroom clerk shifted uncertainly. "Your Honor." Nathaniel stood. Not abruptly, but slowly enough that every person in the courtroom noticed. He had not stood during a hearing in years. The prosecutor looked puzzled. Emily straightened. Even the bailiff frowned. Nathaniel spoke carefully, choosing every word. "This court," he paused, "will enter a brief recess." The prosecutor blinked. "Your Honor?" "I am suspending these proceedings pending further review." Complete silence followed. The courtroom clerk looked confused. "There has been no motion." "I am aware." Nathaniel's voice remained calm. "But I am ordering a recess." Emily exchanged a bewildered glance with the prosecutor. Neither objected. Neither understood. Rachel stood frozen. Had she done something wrong? Was the hearing delayed because of paperwork? Had the judge suddenly become ill? Nothing made sense. Nathaniel gathered the case file with slower movements than usual. Before leaving the bench, his eyes found the necklace one final time. Rachel instinctively touched it. She had no idea why the judge kept looking at it. Neither did anyone else. As Nathaniel disappeared through the chamber door behind the courtroom, he closed it quietly. The moment the latch clicked into place, he leaned both hands against his desk. His breathing became uneven. His eyes drifted toward the old wooden cabinet standing in the corner of his chambers. The cabinet that held the small wooden box. The box he had refused to open for nearly 3 decades. Outside, whispers spread through the courtroom. "What just happened? I've never seen Judge Carter do that." Was there a legal issue? Reporters hurried into the hallway, already typing updates onto their phones. Within minutes, courthouse staff began asking one another the same question. Why would the most composed judge in Franklin County interrupt an ordinary misdemeanor theft case? No one realized the answer had nothing to do with the charge. It had everything to do with a small, silver maple leaf necklace that had quietly survived 30 years, waiting to be seen again. Judge Nathaniel Carter closed the door to his chambers and stood perfectly still. Outside, he could faintly hear the muffled voices of attorneys trying to understand why the morning docket had suddenly stopped. Someone knocked once, then quietly walked away after receiving no answer. Nathaniel barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the old oak cabinet in the corner of the room. For 30 years he had walked past it almost every day. For 30 years he had convinced himself that the past belonged where it was carefully folded away behind a brass latch. Now, for the first time in decades, he crossed the room without hesitation. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the cabinet. Inside sat the small, wooden box. Dust had gathered along its edges. He lifted it carefully onto his desk and slowly released the latch. The hinges creaked softly. Inside were objects that no one else would have considered valuable. A faded student identification card, a worn bus pass, 3 handwritten notes tied together with blue ribbon, a receipt from a campus bookstore dated September 14th, 1994, a black and white photograph of the old law school building before it had been renovated. Beneath them all rested a folded envelope with no stamp. Across the front in neat handwriting were 2 words. "Thank you." Nathaniel closed his eyes. He had written that letter 30 years earlier. He had never found the courage or the opportunity to deliver it. His thoughts carried him back to the autumn of 1994. He was 23 then, the first person in his family to attend college. His father had died in a factory accident when Nathaniel was 15. His mother worked double shifts at a laundry service until arthritis made it impossible for her to continue. Every semester had been a battle. Scholarships, part-time jobs, student loans, skipped meals, second-hand textbooks. He often stayed inside the law school library until midnight because the building was warm, brightly lit, and quieter than the tiny apartment he shared with 2 roommates. That was where he first met Grace Baker. Most students never noticed the overnight custodians. Nathaniel did, not because he was unusually observant, because Grace always greeted every person she passed. "Good evening. Study hard. Don't forget to eat." Simple words, offered without expecting conversation. Grace worked with a gray custodial cart that squeaked every few feet. She hummed softly while mopping long hallways, sometimes old gospel songs, sometimes melodies Nathaniel had never heard before. Around her neck hung a silver maple leaf necklace that caught the fluorescent lights whenever she laughed. One freezing December night, Nathaniel remained alone in the library. His constitutional law textbook lay open in front of him, but he hadn't turned a page in nearly an hour. He was staring at a tuition notice. The balance due exceeded everything he had managed to save. If he failed to pay by Friday morning, the university would suspend his enrollment before the spring semester. Grace quietly entered the library, pushing her mop bucket. She immediately sensed something was wrong. "You've been reading the same page since I started this floor." Nathaniel managed a weak smile. "I guess I'm not concentrating." Grace leaned the mop against a bookshelf. "Tell me." He almost refused. Instead, exhaustion answered for him. "I think I'm done. Done studying. Done pretending I can afford this." Grace sat across from him. Without interruption, she listened while Nathaniel explained everything. The tuition, the overdue rent, his mother's declining health, the 3 jobs that still weren't enough. When he finished, embarrassment filled the silence. "I shouldn't have told you all that." Grace smiled gently. "Sometimes people don't need advice. They just need someone willing to listen." Nathaniel laughed quietly. "I don't see a way out." Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "The world already has enough people who quit one day before their miracle." Nathaniel shook his head. "Miracles cost money." Grace chuckled softly. "Sometimes." She stood, picked up her cart, and returned to work. Nathaniel assumed the conversation had ended. The following afternoon, the financial aid office called unexpectedly. His outstanding tuition balance had been paid in full. Anonymous donor. No explanation. No conditions. Nathaniel spent the next week asking administrators who had helped him. No one knew. Or no one would say. Months later, shortly before graduation, he accidentally overheard 2 maintenance employees talking in a supply room. One mentioned that Grace had pawned the only valuable thing she owned to help that young law student. Nathaniel's heart nearly stopped. He immediately found Grace cleaning windows near the east entrance. "What did you do?" Grace looked genuinely confused. "What do you mean, my tuition?" She smiled. "You graduated because you worked for it. You sold something." Grace looked away. It wasn't important. Nathaniel noticed something immediately. The silver maple leaf necklace was gone. "You sold your necklace." Grace laughed softly. "I only pawned it." "Why," she shrugged, "it can be redeemed." "What if you couldn't get it back?" Grace looked at him as though the answer were obvious. "Then I'd still have something more valuable." Nathaniel couldn't speak. Grace continued washing the glass. "When you become a lawyer," he interrupted. "If." "When," she repeated firmly. "I want you to remember one thing." She looked directly into his eyes. "If life ever puts someone desperate in front of you," she smiled, "look twice before you judge once." Nathaniel promised he would never forget. A few weeks after graduation, he returned to campus hoping to thank her properly. Grace had resigned. No forwarding address, no phone number. She had simply disappeared from his life. The only thing she left behind was the memory of a silver maple leaf necklace. The exact same necklace he had just seen around Rachel Baker's neck. Nathaniel slowly opened his eyes. The courtroom was waiting. Rachel was waiting. But before he could return to the bench, he needed to answer one question that had haunted him for 30 years. Could the woman standing before him truly be Grace Baker's daughter? Judge Nathaniel Carter remained seated at his desk long after the memories had settled into silence. The wooden box lay open before him. His eyes wandered from the faded bookstore receipt to the undelivered letter, then back again. For 30 years, he had imagined hundreds of possible endings to Grace Baker's story. Perhaps she had retired somewhere warm. Perhaps she had moved closer to family. Perhaps she had simply wanted a quieter life. Never, not once, had he imagined that her daughter would stand before him in a courtroom accused of stealing baby formula. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "Judge?" It was Claire Morrison. Nathaniel took a slow breath before answering. "Come in." Claire entered cautiously. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Nathaniel nodded. "I will be." She glanced toward the open wooden box. In all the years she had worked for him, she had never seen it open. "I've never seen those before." "You weren't supposed to." Claire remained silent, sensing this was no ordinary conversation. Nathaniel finally spoke. "I believe the defendant may be the daughter of someone who changed my life." Claire's expression shifted from concern to surprise. "The woman in today's case? I can't prove it. Yet." He picked up the faded photograph from the box. It showed the entrance of the old law school. Students walked in every direction, bundled in winter coats. Near the edge of the picture, almost hidden beside a custodial cart, stood Grace. The photograph was blurry. Her face wasn't perfectly clear, but the silver maple leaf necklace reflected enough light to make it unmistakable. Nathaniel handed the photograph to Claire. "I've never forgotten that necklace." Claire looked carefully at the image. "It does look remarkably similar." "It isn't similar," Nathaniel answered quietly. "It's the same one." Claire returned the photograph. "What are you going to do?" Nathaniel looked toward Rachel's case file. "First, I need facts." Within minutes, he called the courthouse records office. He requested permission to review archived public records connected to Grace Baker. Because the information related to determining a potential judicial conflict of interest, the request was processed immediately. Nearly an hour later, an elderly records clerk arrived carrying a gray archival folder. "Some of these files had to be pulled from storage," the clerk explained. Nathaniel thanked him. The folder contained employment records, a death certificate, and several old public documents. Grace Baker, occupation custodial services, address history, tax records. One final document immediately caught his attention. Emergency contact. Rachel Baker, relationship daughter. Nathaniel closed his eyes. It was true. His heartbeat slowed not from relief, but from the weight of certainty. He continued reading. Grace had died 6 years earlier, after complications from congestive heart failure. There were no significant assets listed in probate, no property, no savings, only personal belongings transferred to her daughter. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. Grace had spent her life quietly serving others. She had left this world with almost nothing. Yet everything Nathaniel had achieved afterward traced back to one decision she made in a nearly empty law school library. Without her, he might never have graduated, never passed the bar, never become a judge, never met Margaret, never built the life he had lived. He whispered into the empty room, "You never told anyone." Claire watched him carefully. "What do you mean?" "She never wanted recognition." He opened another document. Attached to the probate inventory was a handwritten note from Rachel requesting that all of her mother's personal effects remain together. One sentence stood out. "The necklace stays with me because Mom said it reminds us to choose kindness before judgment." Nathaniel read the sentence twice, then a third time. Almost the exact words Grace had spoken to him 30 years ago. He looked toward the courthouse window. People hurried along the sidewalk below, unaware that an old promise had just returned to claim him. Claire broke the silence gently. "If she's truly Grace Baker's daughter?" Nathaniel nodded before she finished. "I cannot continue presiding over this case." "You've already recognized the conflict." "I have." Claire hesitated. "But the timing—" Nathaniel understood. If he disclosed everything now, questions would inevitably follow. Why had he recessed the hearing? Had he already formed opinions? Could either side claim bias? His duty as a judge required only one answer: transparency, nothing less. He picked up the undelivered letter. The paper had yellowed with age. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained legible. "Dear Mrs. Baker, you probably don't realize what you've done for me. One day I hope to become the kind of lawyer who deserves the faith you placed in a frightened student. If I ever have the chance to repay your kindness, I promise I won't waste it." Nathaniel stopped reading. His promise had never been about paying Grace back. That was impossible. Kindness was not a debt that could be settled. It was a responsibility passed forward. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. Then he reached for the telephone. "Claire." "Yes, Judge." "Please contact the administrative judge." She immediately understood. "I'll arrange it, and notify both counsel that I intend to disclose a personal conflict on the record." Claire paused. "They'll have questions. They deserve answers." As she left the room, Nathaniel remained alone once more. He looked down at Rachel's booking photograph. The exhaustion on her face reminded him painfully of Grace during those long winter nights. Always tired, always working, always finding enough strength to encourage someone else. He imagined Rachel growing up with that same woman, listening to the same gentle advice, watching the same quiet acts of kindness, completely unaware that her mother had once altered the course of a young stranger's entire future. Nathaniel stood and walked to the window. His reflection stared back at him. Not as a judge, not as a respected public servant, but as the frightened 23-year-old who had once believed his dreams had ended. Grace Baker had looked past his circumstances and seen his potential. Now, 3 decades later, her daughter stood before a justice system that had seen only her worst decision. Nathaniel quietly rested one hand against the cool glass. "I can't erase what happened to you, Rachel," he whispered, "but I can make sure the law begins with honesty." He straightened his robe, closed the wooden box, and prepared to walk back into the courtroom not to rescue the daughter of the woman who had saved him, but to do the one thing Grace herself would have expected. Judge the case with integrity, even if that meant stepping away from it. When Courtroom 4B reconvened that afternoon, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Word had already spread through the courthouse. Judge Nathaniel Carter had recessed an ordinary misdemeanor case without explanation. Clerks whispered in the hallways. Attorneys quietly exchanged theories outside the elevators. Even the courthouse reporters sensed that whatever had happened behind the judge's chambers had nothing to do with a $47 can of baby formula. Rachel noticed the tension the moment she walked back into the courtroom. Emily Foster leaned closer before they sat. Something has changed. You think it's about me? Emily shook her head. I don't know. Rachel instinctively touched the silver maple leaf necklace beneath her collar. She had done so countless times over the past few days. It calmed her. She had no idea that every time her fingers rested on the worn pendant, someone else in the room was remembering a promise made 3 decades earlier. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the courtroom deputy called everyone to rise. Judge Carter entered as calmly as always. Yet those who knew him well noticed subtle differences. His face carried unusual solemnity. His steps were slower. He placed his leather folder on the bench, but did not immediately open it. Instead, he looked directly toward both counsel. Please be seated. Everyone obeyed. Nathaniel folded his hands. Before this matter proceeds, the court must address an issue concerning judicial ethics. The courtroom became perfectly still. Emily exchanged a puzzled glance with the prosecutor. Assistant Prosecutor Daniel Whitaker frowned slightly. Nathaniel continued. During today's proceedings, I recognized information that may create the appearance of a personal connection relevant to this case. No one spoke. As judges, we are obligated not only to remain impartial, but to avoid circumstances in which impartiality could reasonably be questioned. Rachel listened without understanding. Was she about to receive a different judge? Had someone filed a complaint? Nathaniel looked briefly toward her before returning his attention to the courtroom. After reviewing additional records during recess, I have determined that the defendant is the daughter of a woman who provided significant personal assistance to me many years before I entered public service. Soft murmurs spread across the gallery. The courtroom deputy immediately called for silence. Nathaniel waited until the room settled again. The assistance I received occurred more than 30 years ago. He chose every word carefully. The individual is now deceased. Rachel's eyebrows slowly drew together. Deceased? Her mother? Could he possibly be talking about... Grace Nathaniel continued. Although this history has no bearing upon the legal facts of this case, it is sufficient to require disclosure under the ethical obligations of this court. Emily's expression shifted from confusion to astonishment. She looked toward Rachel. Rachel simply stared at the bench. Her lips parted slightly. She couldn't remember ever hearing her mother mention anyone who later became a judge. Nathaniel spoke again. Accordingly, I hereby recuse myself from any further proceedings in this matter. A quiet gasp escaped someone seated in the back row. Daniel Whitaker slowly rose. Your Honor. Nathaniel nodded respectfully. Mr. Whitaker, I appreciate the court's transparency. So does the state. Nathaniel inclined his head. Emily stood next. The defense likewise appreciates Your Honor's disclosure. Nathaniel offered a faint smile. Thank you, counsel. He then turned toward Rachel for the first time since returning to the bench. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. Miss Baker. Rachel looked up. I cannot continue as the judge assigned to your case. She nodded uncertainly. I understand. I want you to understand something else as well. Emily glanced toward him, wondering how far he intended to go. Nathaniel remained careful. The law requires fairness. Rachel listened. And fairness sometimes requires a judge to step aside. Rachel swallowed quietly. I appreciate your honesty. Nathaniel gave one slow nod. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He saw Grace's gentle smile reflected in Rachel's tired eyes. Rachel saw only a judge treating her with unexpected respect. Nothing more. Nathaniel looked towards the courtroom clerk. This matter will be reassigned immediately through normal administrative procedures. The clerk acknowledged the instruction. Court procedure required nothing further. Yet Nathaniel remained seated for another moment. He glanced across the courtroom. Many people there had watched hundreds of hearings. Most would remember this one for years, not because of the legal issue, because they had witnessed something rarely seen, a judge willingly surrendering authority to protect the integrity of justice. Nathaniel took one final breath. There is one additional observation I wish to place on the record. Neither attorney objected. It is not evidence. It is not a legal finding. It should not influence whatever decision is ultimately reached by the court assigned to this matter. He paused. His eyes moved slowly across the courtroom. Our justice system exists to evaluate actions. Another pause. But every action belongs to a human being. Silence filled the room. We must never become so efficient at judging conduct that we forget to see the person standing before us. No one moved. The law must remain firm. His voice stayed calm. But dignity must remain visible. Even the court reporter stopped looking at the keyboard for a brief second. Nathaniel closed his folder. My responsibility in this case ends today. He struck the gavel once. This court stands in recess. Everyone rose automatically. Nathaniel stepped down from the bench rather than using the private exit behind him. As he walked across the courtroom floor, people instinctively moved aside. When he reached Rachel's table, he stopped. Emily stood respectfully. Nathaniel did not speak about Grace. He did not mention old promises. He did not reveal memories that belonged to another lifetime. Instead, he simply looked at Rachel with quiet sincerity. I wish you and your son well. Rachel blinked, surprised. Thank you, Your Honor. Nathaniel smiled gently. Then he walked past her and continued toward the courtroom doors. Rachel watched him disappear into the hallway. She turned toward Emily. What did my mother do for him? Emily shook her head slowly. I don't know. But whatever it was, she glanced toward the closed courtroom doors. It changed his life. Rachel lowered her eyes to the silver maple leaf necklace resting in her hand. For years, she had believed it carried only memories of her mother. She never imagined it also carried a story that had remained unfinished for 3 decades. Outside the courtroom, Judge Nathaniel Carter walked alone down the quiet corridor. For the first time in 30 years, the promise Grace Baker had asked of him no longer felt like an unpaid debt. It felt like a path that had finally led him exactly where she had hoped it would. 3 days later, Rachel Baker walked back into the Franklin County Courthouse. This time the hallway felt different. People still recognized her from the news, but the whispers had changed. Some looked at her with curiosity instead of condemnation. Others simply stepped aside as she passed. The unexpected disclosure by Judge Nathaniel Carter had become a local news story of its own. Headlines no longer focused only on a mother accused of stealing baby formula. Now they asked larger questions. What happens when poverty reaches the courtroom? How many working parents fall through the cracks? Should emergency assistance begin before desperation becomes a crime? Rachel avoided reading every article. She knew headlines rarely told complete stories. Emily Foster met her outside the courtroom carrying a thick binder. You've been busy, Rachel said. Emily smiled. I've had help. Inside the binder were documents collected over the previous several days, employment evaluations from Maple Grove Senior Care Center, medical records explaining Ethan's dietary condition, letters from neighbors, a statement from Mrs. Denise Walker, a recommendation from Reverend Thomas Green describing Rachel's volunteer work preparing meals after Sunday services whenever she wasn't working. Even Officer Marcus Reed had submitted a factual supplemental statement confirming Rachel had cooperated completely during the arrest and had repeatedly expressed concern only for her son's well-being. Emily closed the binder. None of this changes what happened. Rachel nodded. I know. But it explains who you are. Rachel looked toward the courtroom doors. I never wanted to become an example, Emily answered gently. Maybe examples don't choose themselves. Inside Courtroom 2. A Judge Eleanor Whitman now presided over the case. Unlike Judge Carter, she was known for combining careful legal reasoning with extensive experience in diversion and rehabilitation programs. She greeted both attorneys before reviewing the file. I have read the reports submitted by both parties. The prosecutor stood. The state acknowledges that the defendant has accepted responsibility from the beginning. Emily followed. The defense requests consideration under Franklin County's Community Accountability Diversion Program. Judge Whitman nodded. I have reviewed that request. The hearing proceeded quietly. There was no dramatic argument, no emotional speeches. Instead, every fact was examined carefully. Rachel admitted she had intentionally concealed the formula. She admitted she had attempted to leave without paying. She never tried to minimize her responsibility. When Judge Whitman asked why she had not sought additional assistance before entering the store, Rachel answered honestly. I thought I had already asked everyone. The judge looked at the records. You contacted 3 charities. Yes. You applied for state assistance. Yes. You requested additional work hours. Yes. You sold personal belongings. Rachel nodded again. Yes. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Whitman turned another page. I also see documentation that your application for nutritional assistance exceeded the eligibility limit by $11.42. Yes, Your Honor. The judge removed her glasses. That must have been difficult. Rachel's answer came quietly. I kept thinking maybe someone had made a mistake. Emily watched the exchange without interruption. The facts spoke more powerfully than any argument she could make. Assistant Prosecutor Whitaker stood once more. The state believes accountability remains appropriate. He paused before continuing. However, given the defendant's lack of criminal history, full cooperation, verified financial hardship, and extraordinary character references, the state does not oppose diversion in lieu of conviction. Rachel blinked. She hadn't expected that. Judge Whitman looked toward the prosecutor. The victim. The retailer has agreed to participate in restorative resolution. Emily placed one final document before the court. This includes repayment of the merchandise cost, which has already been made. Rachel turned toward her in surprise. I didn't, Emily whispered. Someone paid it anonymously. Rachel immediately thought of Judge Carter. Emily quietly shook her head. I asked. It wasn't him. Rachel frowned. Then who? Emily smiled softly. I honestly don't know. The answer would remain a mystery. Neither woman realized that after news of the case spread, dozens of strangers had contacted ValueMart, asking to repay the loss. The store had finally accepted the first anonymous payment and refused to reveal the donor's identity. Judge Whitman folded her hands. Miss Baker, Rachel stood. This court finds that your actions violated Ohio law. Rachel lowered her eyes. But the court also finds substantial evidence that this offense arose from exceptional hardship rather than criminal intent. Rachel looked up again. Accordingly, you are accepted into the Community Accountability Diversion Program. A quiet breath escaped Rachel before she realized she had been holding it. Judge Whitman continued. You will complete community service financial counseling and parenting support workshops over the next 12 months. Rachel nodded immediately. I will. If you successfully complete every requirement, the charge will be dismissed, and no criminal conviction will remain on your record. Tears filled Rachel's eyes. Not because she had escaped punishment, because someone had finally given her the opportunity to rebuild. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Whitman smiled gently. Don't thank the court. She glanced briefly towards the gallery. Thank your own choices before the day everything went wrong. Rachel looked confused. Judge Whitman lifted one of the character letters. People spent years writing the evidence that helped you today. Rachel understood. Every hallway she had cleaned, every elderly resident she had encouraged, every neighbor she had quietly helped carry groceries, every meal she had shared. Those ordinary days had become the strongest defense she never knew she was building. After the hearing ended, reporters gathered outside the courthouse. Rachel politely declined interviews. Emily walked beside her toward the parking lot. What happens now? Rachel asked. You go home. And then, you keep every promise you made in there. Rachel smiled for the first time in days. I can do that. Across town, Judge Nathaniel Carter stood quietly inside his chambers, reading the administrative notice confirming the outcome of the hearing. He allowed himself one slow breath of relief. Justice had followed its proper course, not because he had intervened, but because the system had been allowed to see the entire person instead of only the worst moment of her life. He folded the notice and looked once more at the wooden box resting inside his cabinet. Grace Baker had once told a frightened law student to look twice before judging once. Today, without ever entering the courtroom again, her voice had quietly reached everyone who mattered. The first Saturday after the hearing, Rachel Baker stood in front of the bathroom mirror before sunrise, fastening the silver maple leaf necklace around her neck. For the first time in weeks, she did not feel the weight of fear pressing against her chest. She felt responsibility. The diversion program had given her a second chance. Now she intended to prove that the court's faith had not been misplaced. Mrs. Denise Walker knocked gently on the apartment door. I made blueberry pancakes. Rachel laughed. You know you're going to spoil Ethan. That's exactly my plan. Ethan, now healthy and energetic again, clapped his tiny hands from his high chair as Mrs. Walker walked in carrying a warm container wrapped in a towel. Watching him laugh, Rachel silently promised herself that he would never remember the week his mother almost lost everything. Not if she could help it. 3 days later, Rachel reported for her first community service assignment. She expected to spend the day picking up litter or organizing storage rooms. Instead, Linda Collins greeted her outside the Franklin Family Resource Center. I'm glad you're here. Rachel looked around the modest brick building. Children played in a small fenced yard, while parents waited inside for appointments. I thought this was community service. Linda smiled. It is. She handed Rachel a visitor badge. We need someone to organize donated baby supplies. Rachel followed her into a room lined with shelves, boxes of diapers, baby blankets, strollers, infant clothing, formula. Rachel stopped walking. There were dozens of cans, more formula than she had seen in one place in months. Linda noticed her expression. Hard to look at. Rachel nodded honestly. A little. Linda rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. That's understandable. For several moments, Rachel simply stood there. Then she rolled up her sleeves. Where do I start? Linda pointed toward several unopened boxes. Let's build some order out of this chaos. Rachel smiled. I've cleaned bigger messes. By lunchtime, she had organized every shelf by size, expiration date, and nutritional type. Her years working housekeeping had taught her that order created dignity. People searching for help shouldn't have to dig through clutter. Before leaving that afternoon, Linda stopped her. You've done excellent work. Thank you. I'd like to ask you something. Rachel looked up. When your required service hours are finished, Linda hesitated. Would you consider coming back? Rachel blinked. As a volunteer. As staff. Rachel looked surprised. I don't have experience. Linda laughed softly. Rachel glanced around the room. The families coming here don't need experts first. They need someone who understands. The words stayed with Rachel all evening. A week later, she completed another requirement of the diversion program, financial counseling. The instructor discussed budgeting strategies, emergency savings, debt management. Rachel listened carefully, taking notes in the same blue notebook that had once held only impossible calculations. After class ended, the instructor reviewed her notebook. You've tracked every dollar for years. Rachel nodded. I just never had enough dollars. The instructor smiled sadly. Budgeting doesn't solve poverty. No, but it helps when opportunity finally arrives. Rachel carried those words home. Meanwhile, life slowly began settling into a healthier rhythm. Maple Grove restored one of Rachel's lost shifts after another employee retired unexpectedly. Karen Mills also arranged flexible scheduling so Rachel could attend the diversion program without losing income. We're investing in someone who's already invested in everyone else, Karen said simply. Rachel thanked her with tears in her eyes. The greatest surprise came 2 weeks later. Linda called unexpectedly. I have an opening. Rachel assumed she meant another volunteer shift. Instead, Linda continued. A part-time family resource coordinator. Rachel nearly dropped the phone. What would I do? You'd welcome new families. Connect them with assistance. Help organize donations. Explain available programs. Rachel sat down slowly. I've never worked in social services, Linda answered without hesitation. You've lived it. Sometimes that's the best training. Rachel hesitated. What if people judge me because of everything? Linda's voice remained calm. Rachel. Yes. Every person who walks through our doors is carrying something they're ashamed of. Another pause. They don't need someone perfect. They need someone who won't look away. Rachel accepted the position the following morning. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was stable. More importantly, it allowed her to become the person she had desperately needed only weeks earlier. On her first official day, she greeted dozens of families. Some were embarrassed, some angry, some exhausted. Rachel recognized every expression. Late that afternoon, a young mother entered carrying an infant wrapped in a faded green blanket. She stood near the entrance for almost 5 minutes without speaking. Rachel remembered doing the same thing outside government offices, unsure whether to ask for help, unsure whether she deserved it. Rachel walked over slowly. Hi. The woman looked startled. I'm Rachel. The young mother lowered her eyes. I don't know where to begin. Rachel smiled gently. You don't have to. We'll begin together. The woman burst into tears. Rachel guided her toward a chair, brought her a cup of water, and sat beside her instead of across from her. No desk, no barrier, just 2 mothers talking. Later, after the woman had left with diapers formula and several appointment referrals, Linda watched Rachel quietly. You never made her feel small. Rachel looked down. I know what that feels like. Linda nodded. I thought you might. That evening, Rachel returned home carrying a small envelope. Inside was her first paycheck from the resource center. She placed it beside the blue notebook on the kitchen table. Then she opened the notebook to the page where she had once written one desperate sentence. Find another job. She smiled. Below it, she added another line. Become the help you once needed. She closed the notebook and looked toward Ethan, who had fallen asleep hugging a stuffed elephant Mrs. Walker had found at a church donation drive. Rachel reached for the silver maple leaf necklace. Its surface had grown smoother over the years from countless touches. Her mother had once carried hope inside that tiny piece of silver. Now Rachel understood. The necklace had never been about remembering the past. It had always been pointing her toward the future. Nearly 1 year later, Columbus welcomed the first warm Saturday of April with clear blue skies and the kind of sunshine that made people open their windows after a long winter. Rachel Baker unlocked the front door of the Franklin Family Resource Center at exactly 8:00 a.m. The building no longer looked the way it had on her first day. Fresh paint brightened the lobby. Children's drawings covered one wall. A bookshelf held donated storybooks in both English and Spanish. Near the entrance stood the addition Rachel loved most, a large white cabinet with glass doors. Above it hung a simple wooden sign, "Baby Pantry. Take what you need. Leave what you can." The words were intentionally simple. No application, no interview, no judgment. Inside the shelves were neatly organized rows of diapers, baby wipes, infant medicine formula bottles, blankets, and small packages of baby food. Rachel checked expiration dates every Friday afternoon herself. She still believed dignity often began with small details. By 8:30, volunteers started arriving. Mrs. Denise Walker carried homemade muffins for everyone. Karen Mills came wearing jeans instead of her nursing home uniform. Emily Foster volunteered one Saturday each month, helping families understand housing paperwork and benefit applications without charging a single dollar. Even Officer Marcus Reed stopped by before beginning his patrol shift. He walked through the front door carrying 2 cardboard boxes. "I've got another donation." Rachel smiled. "Formula." He nodded. "And diapers?" She laughed softly. "I think you're becoming our most reliable supplier." Marcus shrugged. "My church collected them." Rachel knew that wasn't entirely true. She had noticed the receipts tucked inside several donation boxes over the past few months. Marcus had quietly been buying supplies with his own money. He never mentioned it. She never embarrassed him by asking. Some acts of kindness deserved privacy. Around mid-morning, the front door opened again. Judge Nathaniel Carter entered without any announcement. He wore an ordinary Navy jacket instead of judicial robes. Very few people recognized him at first. Rachel noticed him immediately. She walked toward him with a warm smile. "Good morning, Judge Carter." He smiled gently. "Today I'm just Nathaniel." She nodded. "Then welcome." He looked around the room. Children laughed while coloring pictures at a small table. Volunteers sorted donated clothing. Young parents drank coffee while waiting for appointments. Nobody looked frightened. Nobody looked ashamed. Nathaniel quietly took in every detail. "This place feels different." Rachel understood what he meant. "We worked hard to make sure it does." Linda Collins approached, carrying a clipboard. "Judge Carter." "Nathaniel, please." Linda laughed. "I'll try." She thanked him for supporting several community initiatives over the past year. Nathaniel accepted none of the praise. "The credit belongs here." He gestured toward Rachel. "And everyone who refused to let one terrible day define a family." Rachel lowered her eyes. She still found compliments uncomfortable. Just before noon, a young woman entered carrying a baby wrapped inside an oversized gray sweatshirt. She looked no older than 20. Her shoes were soaked from walking through spring rain. She paused at the entrance exactly the way Rachel once had, eyes scanning the room, unsure whether to step farther inside. Rachel immediately recognized that look, fear mixed with pride. She approached slowly. "Hi." The young mother startled slightly. "I'm sorry." "I wasn't sure," Rachel smiled. "You don't have to apologize." The woman looked close to tears. "I don't have any money." Rachel gently pointed towards the baby pantry. "Good." The young mother looked confused. "Good," Rachel nodded. "Because everything in there has already been paid for." She hesitated. "By who?" Rachel glanced around the room. "By people who remember what it feels like to need help." The young mother walked cautiously toward the shelves. She picked up one can of infant formula, then immediately tried to put it back. I shouldn't take the last one. Rachel looked inside the cabinet. There were still several cans. You aren't. The woman smiled weakly. I've never done this before, Rachel answered with quiet honesty. Neither had I. The young mother looked at her, not understanding. Rachel simply smiled. Some stories didn't need to be told immediately. The woman selected 2 cans of formula, a package of diapers, and a small bottle of infant fever medicine. Rachel noticed her staring at the medicine for several seconds. Is everything okay? The young mother whispered. I was trying to decide yesterday whether to buy medicine or food. Rachel felt a chill run through her. The memory came back with perfect clarity, standing in the Value Mart aisle, calculator in one hand, formula in the other, thinking there was no right answer. Without speaking, Rachel reached over and placed an additional thermometer into the woman's bag. No charge. The woman looked ready to protest. Rachel gently shook her head. Take it. Tears filled the young mother's eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Rachel smiled. When life becomes easier. She paused, hearing her mother's voice as clearly as ever. Look twice before you judge once. Nathaniel, standing several feet away, froze. The words reached him instantly. Exactly the same sentence, exactly the same gentle tone. Grace Baker. 30 years disappeared again. But this time the memory brought peace instead of regret. He watched Rachel help the young mother carry supplies to her car. No cameras, no reporters, no applause, only quiet kindness. Emily walked over beside him. She's remarkable. Nathaniel nodded. She always was. Emily looked surprised. You say that as though you've known her for years. Nathaniel smiled thoughtfully. I've known the heart that raised her. That afternoon before leaving, Nathaniel quietly approached the baby pantry cabinet. He placed a plain, white envelope beneath one of the storage baskets. No name, no signature. Inside was a personal donation large enough to keep the pantry stocked with specialized infant formula for many months. Linda discovered it only after he had already driven away. Rachel never learned who left it. She only smiled when Linda showed her the envelope. Whoever it was, Rachel said softly. They understood exactly what this shelf means. As the center closed for the evening, Rachel locked the glass doors of the baby pantry. Sunlight reflected briefly across the silver maple leaf necklace resting against her collar. Once that necklace had reminded her to survive. Now it reminded her of something even greater. The greatest kindness was not helping someone after they fell. It was building a place where fewer people would have to fall at all. 7 years later, the silver maple leaf necklace rested in Rachel Baker's hands as the morning sunlight poured through her kitchen window. She turned it over carefully, tracing the tiny scratch across the center of the leaf with her thumb. Time had softened the silver even more. It had also softened the pain attached to it. Across the room, 7-year-old Ethan sat at the table finishing his cereal while reading aloud from a library book. He had grown into a curious, kind-hearted boy, with his mother's gentle smile and an endless habit of asking questions. Mom, Rachel looked up. Yes. Mrs. Walker said Grandma Grace was the bravest person she ever knew. Rachel smiled. I think she was. What made her brave? Rachel walked over and sat beside him. She chose to help people even when she didn't have much herself. Like giving people food. Yes. And hope. Ethan considered that answer for a moment. Can someone give hope? Rachel looked down at the necklace in her palm. They can. Sometimes they don't even know they're doing it. That afternoon, the Franklin Family Resource Center celebrated the opening of its 4th baby pantry location in Columbus. The idea that had begun with one small cabinet now served hundreds of families each month. Local businesses donated supplies, churches organized monthly collections, pediatric clinics referred struggling parents before emergencies became crises. The program had become something larger than anyone originally imagined. Rachel stood near the entrance, greeting families one by one. She no longer introduced herself as someone who had once needed help. She simply welcomed everyone with the same words. "I'm glad you're here." Because she remembered how powerful those words had been the first time someone had said them to her. Mrs. Denise Walker, now slower on her feet, but still full of energy, supervised the refreshment table. Emily Foster served on the nonprofit's legal advisory board. Linda Collins had recently retired, though she still volunteered every Tuesday morning because, as she liked to joke, retirement had only made her busier. Officer Marcus Reed arrived carrying another donation of diapers. Rachel laughed. "You still refuse to come empty-handed?" Marcus grinned. "Some habits are worth keeping." A few minutes later, a familiar black sedan quietly pulled into the parking lot. Judge Nathaniel Carter stepped out, no longer wearing judicial robes, but a simple gray suit. He had retired 6 months earlier, after decades on the bench. He deliberately entered through the side door, hoping not to attract attention. Rachel noticed him anyway. She walked over and embraced him warmly. "I'm so glad you came. I wouldn't have missed this." They stood together for a moment, watching young families fill the building. Nathaniel smiled. "Your mother would be proud." Rachel's eyes glistened. "I hope so." Several years earlier, after the legal case had ended and emotions had settled, Nathaniel had finally told Rachel the complete story of Grace Baker. He had shown her the old wooden box, the bookstore receipt, the faded photograph, the letter he had never delivered. Together, they had cried over memories neither of them had expected to share. Rachel had learned something about her mother that changed her forever. Grace had never spoken about helping a struggling law student, not because she had forgotten, because she believed kindness lost something precious when it was performed for recognition. Nathaniel had kept Grace's handwritten grocery list inside the wooden box ever since. At the bottom of the list, beside bread and laundry soap, Grace had written one sentence: "Kindness is only complete when it continues." Those words eventually became the mission statement of the baby pantry program. The afternoon ceremony was intentionally simple. No politicians, no television cameras, no oversized checks. Just volunteers, families, and neighbors. When Rachel stepped to the microphone, she looked across the crowd before speaking. "Years ago," she began, "I believed asking for help meant I had failed." She paused. "I was wrong." Silence settled over the audience. "I learned that accepting kindness with gratitude gives someone else the opportunity to live out their own kindness." She looked toward Nathaniel, then toward Mrs. Walker, Emily, Marcus, Linda. "So today isn't about one person helping another. It's about a community refusing to let people struggle alone." Applause filled the room. After the ceremony, families began visiting the pantry shelves. A father selected diapers, a grandmother picked up children's medicine, a pregnant teenager quietly accepted a bag of baby clothes. Rachel watched each interaction with quiet satisfaction. Then she felt a small tug on her sleeve. It was Ethan. He held a shopping bag in both hands. "I brought something." "What is it?" He opened the bag. Inside were 3 cans of infant formula he had insisted on buying with money he had saved from birthdays and doing neighborhood chores. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to give all of it." Ethan smiled. "I know." He walked carefully to the baby pantry shelf and placed the cans beside the others. Then he stepped back. "Now another baby can eat." Rachel wrapped her arms around him. Behind them, Nathaniel quietly removed his glasses. For a brief moment, he saw 3 generations standing together. Grace Baker, who had once pawned her necklace to save a stranger's future. Rachel Baker, who had transformed her worst day into hope for countless families. And Ethan, a little boy who had never forgotten that someone else's child mattered too. The silver maple leaf necklace caught the afternoon sunlight one final time. It had begun as a simple gift from a mother to her daughter. It became a reminder that compassion could outlive the people who first offered it. And now, through a young boy placing baby formula onto a pantry shelf with a proud smile, it had become something even greater. A promise that kindness once planted never truly disappears. Life has a way of judging people by the few seconds the world gets to see. A photograph, a headline, a short video online, sometimes that's all it takes for someone to be labeled forever. But every person carries a story that began long before their hardest day. Rachel's journey reminds us that dignity is not measured by how often we fall, but by the choices we continue making after life pushes us to the edge. Grace Baker never imagined that one quiet act of generosity would shape the future of a young law student. Rachel never imagined that the values her mother taught her would one day help transform an entire community. And Ethan learned one of the most important lessons a child can learn. Kindness is not something we repay, it is something we pass on. Perhaps someone around you is carrying a burden you cannot see. A kind word, a patient heart, or a simple act of generosity may become the turning point in a life you'll never fully know. Before judging someone's worst moment, try looking twice. You may discover a story that changes your own heart. If this story touched you, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from and what part of Rachel's journey stayed with you the most. If you believe stories about compassion, hope, and second chances deserve to be shared, please consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys that remind us of the quiet power of ordinary people.